Uh, what a fascinating talk we had today from Tim, and I could relate to so much of what he said. Thought very much of some things which Mahatma Gandhi said at that time. He has a talisman which is put up on Parliament in India, that whenever you think of a policy, remember the face of the poorest person you've seen and ask yourself the question, what does this policy do for him or her? It's a simple sentence, but it puts a perspective when we make these policies, when we make things done. We think of the poor sometime as some amorphous group, and he's talking about looking at a person. Look at someone who you can relate to. And another one in a lighter vein where he was talking about the BBC film which he liked. When Gandhi went to London and he met the king, and he was in his loincloth, there's people who've seen the picture of it. And the king, in humor, said, why do you wear so little? Why are you only wearing this thing? And Gandhi said, I think, sir, that you are wearing enough clothes for both of us. and that was his answer for that one. But I think Tim also brought in the humility with which what was charity has now become partnership, how you move there. And one of the things which we tell people when they go out is that always start by asking someone who you go to work with, what is it that you can teach us? We had a program recently where we were getting volunteers from the city of Ahmedabad to work in slums. These are people who are not trained. They're people who want to put in 2 hours every week to work in cities. And they said, tell us how we should go about it. I said, when you go into the slum, before you say anything, find out what it is that little child in the slum can teach you. And that little thing, it could be how to draw something, how to have a top, catch it in your hand again. It could be some cooking thing. It could be something. But if you go saying that I am come to learn and teach, it changes the mindset that people had. And I thought that came out so clearly in how Tim described the transformation in how he was going about it. Another thing which he said reminded me of some work we had done in an area where there is fluorosis. Amreli district has heavy fluorosis, and we were asked to develop a communication package there. And when you go into those little huts, there is a rope which hangs above each bed. And the reason for that rope is that because of fluorosis, people have to hold the rope in the morning when they want to get up from the bed. Okay, so even at 40 or 35, people need that rope to get up. But when you ask them what is the problem, almost none of them can say that's the problem, because that's something they see in every other household. And because they have not got the experience that other people maybe get up without a rope, they think that that's the way it is. And in much of what we are trying to do, trying to change, because we work in single cultures, we sometimes take a whole lot of things for granted, that this is how things are, this is how things are done, till you go into another culture and you ask very fundamental questions. When you come to my city, you will ask questions which I, sitting there, have never seen, never been able to ask, because I just take it for granted. For me, it is that rope. And when I come here and ask a stupid question, it is equally something which is fresh, and that is something which is wonderful to do. I wanted to say that some of the problems we have, I do think, are to do with the way humans see time. When you have an earthquake, and Prasad and we work together on that, where several thousand people die within minutes. It is news, it is crisis, people see it that way. If there's a plane crash, we see it that way. But if several people or more people die on the road due to bad traffic, but spread over 6 months or a year, we don't see it that way. And it's something like gaining weight. Because the incremental weight you've gained every day from yesterday is not big enough for you to feel shocked about it. But sometimes only when you open an album and see an old photograph of yours and you say, oh my God, is this what happened to me in 5 years? That you recognize that that was a huge change. But the huge change is not seen because it is slow in our eyes. For someone like Tim who talks about millenniums, we talk about some of these changes as less than a second, they're fraction, they're very fast. But for humans, we see change in a different time frame. And the challenge of climate change is how do we make people realize that the changes are much more dramatic than anything we've ever faced, but they're happening at a pace which is in geological time extremely fast, but in human time, humans can't see it. And we don't have the patience. This morning's paper here has a cartoon which talks about climate change exhaustion. And that's what's happening. We don't have what it takes to stick to a problem for 20 years to solve this. But we will need to. And we need to change the way we are. And I hope this lecture series can get us to change that perspective. Thank you.
I want to take my point here from Tim's, I think, eloquently made the point that climate change is really a development problem with environmental characteristics. It's created by modern, high-energy intensive societies, transmitted through the Earth system, in a sense, to affect most particularly those people who can't enjoy the benefits of those modern, high-energy societies. And one of the interesting things as a geographer to think about is that we've always understood climate change as a big problem, as a problem for countries, these homogeneous spaces on maps, to resolve on the global forum on our behalf. And what we're hearing tonight is actually that this is a problem that occurs at many different scales, from the level of individuals through to all sorts of institutions and globally. And I think part of the solution here is to think a little bit more critically about the role of scale in the politics of climate change. And I want to, in a sense, spend a few minutes saying why I don't think we can look to the answers to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change entirely here. And let me make my point this way. If I was asked how to cause inaction on climate change, I would do 5 things. You can call this my 5-point manifesto for climate change: incapacitation. Make sure the problem is described always as uncertain and as an environmental problem rather than a social justice and development problem. Invest in research that always highlights uncertainties. Critique and attack any research that says the problem might be certain and we might have solutions. Second point, make it know that the consequences of doing this are fundamentally an environmental problem that's going to affect ecosystems and not people. And when it comes to a discussion about affecting people, make it very clear that it's a poor person's problem and it's not going to affect us in the rich countries. What's a little bit more poverty if they're already poor? So we can see this as somebody else's problem, and if we make it that way, then people in developed countries maybe don't think it's their problem. Make it known that the costs of solving this problem are high and will fall on people in rich countries, and propagate the idea that the best way of solving this problem is through an international treaty that requires all 196 countries in the world to agree on a course of action. Make sure that like most international regimes, there are no rules about how decisions are to be made, so that the consensus of all parties is required for all decisions. Ensure that this regime doesn't meet very often. Make sure it has an ever-expanding agenda of issues to discuss, and therefore make sure that only the very large countries with very large delegations can have effective power in that international climate change treaty. And ensure that the principal activity of these meetings is to horse trade over the meanings of words on text. I personally sat in a climate change negotiation as a negotiator for one of the small states and spent a day and a half arguing about whether we should use the word welcome or note in text about how the UNFCCC will receive the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. And that's a very effective way of making sure there is no genuinely political discussion about principles and values and the global distribution of benefits and costs on action on climate change. Fill it full of lawyers and diplomats and make them talk about words on a page. And the 5th action that I would do to make sure there was no global action on climate change would be to propagate very strongly an idea that action on climate change can only happen until this international agreement is reached, after which point we can do something about it. In this way, everyone is excused from doing anything, waiting for an international regime to deliver an outcome that it can't deliver an outcome on. And if you think I'm being facetious, that's a pretty accurate description of where we're at right now with climate change, science and policy. And so this means that leaving it to the world of states to negotiate an outcome through an international agreement isn't going to get us the kind of action we need, given the emissions that we have and the risks that we face. So now let's look a little closer. How many minutes have I got left? 2. If we look at smaller scales, we start to see interesting things happening in the world. Since October of last year, there's been 154 new policy announcements from governments around the world on climate change. And 80 of those have been setting emissions targets. As of 2008, investment in renewable energy has exceeded investment in coal, oil and gas. We're seeing shareholders challenging public companies to take action on climate change. We're seeing faith-based groups emerged engaging with this issue, including in the Pacific Islands where I work. We're seeing states, provinces and cities and local governments taking action, networking, coordinating, sharing experiences and starting to achieve meaningful reductions in emissions. We're seeing individuals starting to make conscious decisions as consumers, as political actors, and as people living in communities. And I hope these actions are a portent of things to come. They're showing that action is coming despite the lack of action from governments at the international regime. And to go back to where I started from then, we should think about these actions as not simply environmental actions. We should think about them as in very real sense, actions that sustain the possibility of global justice and the possibility of development as defined by people around the world. The decisions that you make about climate change are not environmental decisions. They're decisions about global justice, and I think Tim made that point very clearly. Thanks.
India, like many other countries in the world, is faced with what could be called 3 colliding trends on energy. The first trend is that global demand for energy is going up and up. It is estimated to increase by 30% between 2010 and 2030. The second colliding trend is all about energy security. India itself only has large quantities of coal. We have very little gas and virtually no oil. So we are dependent on coal for our energy requirements. We do, of course, also have a large amount of sunlight. The third colliding trend is climate change and what that does to this entire concept of energy. So as a country, we are actually sort of constrained, if you like, by these colliding trends. What do? Each one seems to be hitting against the other. And when we look on top of that and realize that, as I mentioned in a previous talk, that we have about 400 million people in the countryside who do not have access to electricity, and the government wants to really bring development to the poor, that's a huge challenge. How do we do it? And the only method we know is the age-old method, the Western method of growth, of pumping in more and more energy and using fossil fuels for that energy. So when we look at the challenge that is facing India, it is quite remarkable that the Indian government actually has recognized these issues and has actually put in policies and is implementing those policies towards climate change. And they've recognized that climate change is not just about switching from coal or fossil fuels to renewables, but they've recognized that it's a holistic picture, that you have to look after the forests, you have to look after your glaciers, you have to look after agriculture, you have to bring in renewables, and so on. So they've got these 8 national missions and a subsidiary set of 28 strategic initiatives which work towards this. And what it brings about is the fact that we have to work in collaboration. We have to work together as industry, as government, as NGOs like Kartikeya and his outfit, and financial institutions. That is the only way we can tackle climate change. One of the great opportunities that India has, and indeed most of the developing world, but India particularly, because we are growing, galloping along at about 8.5% GDP growth every year. The opportunity we have is actually to determine a sustainable growth path. And really, when you look at it, and you look at the problem that is facing us, we have solutions. We have a solution which is composed of getting in distributed generation, bringing that distributed generation from renewable sources, working together with villages, enabling them to absorb this energy and use it for economic purposes. And this is something that's starting to happen. And it has to be catalyzed by business and industry. That is the only way it will move. And it's great to see some of these things already happening. There are lots of startup companies actually dealing with this, whether it's through solar lanterns or whether it's through stoves, which are much more efficient and where the housewife doesn't breathe in dangerous smoke. Whether it is small little outfits. I was really struck the other day by a person who'd come back from the United States after making millions, but he came back to the poorest state in India, Bihar, and started setting up in the worst of the badlands small little biomass gasification units and actually selling power to the villagers. And it succeeded. They actually now have energy to utilize for their agricultural purposes. So there's a lot happening around this system of trying to determine a different path. It's not easy, but it's happening. And I think that is the great optimism that all of us have in India. We ourselves as a company are working towards this by putting in money into various renewable resources, by helping to develop some of these initiatives, by working in collaboration with many of these people. And it's beginning to bite. Maybe it'll take time. Maybe things will get a little worse before they get better. But I think, in many ways, India is a little misunderstood, because when it goes into negotiating arenas, we are so petrified of the West pushing unacceptable policies on us that we always come up with negotiating stances which say, touch me not. But actually, behind all that, there is a lot of work going on. I'm always struck, and when we talk about developing countries, there's a little country called Bhutan. I don't know how many of you know about Bhutan. It's a small little mountainous country to the northeast of India. And that country believes in renewables and in sustainability. We went across there recently. We've got a project there. And when you talk to the Prime Minister, the only thing he talks about is sustainability. He doesn't talk about anything else. And I still remember him saying that, there was this little mistake about the glaciers melting by the UNFCCC. And he says, I went to a particular forum and I talked to them. And I said, forget it. I travel past Mount Everest twice a month. And I see it getting grayer. And to me, that means glaciers are melting. And that is an incontrovertible fact. And therefore, we better work on it. And they have a lovely concept. All of us talk about the gross domestic product, GDP. They have something called the gross national happiness, GNH. Now, it sounds corny, but they've actually worked out what GNH means. And they really do believe that that is the way to move forward. So developing countries have started understanding the issue of climate change and actually having their own path towards working and embracing this entire issue. And sometimes, when we talk about awareness and how do we get people to change their lifestyles, you do need little triggers. You do need little hooks to make sure that it is accepted by people. And Bhutan has done it one way by talking about gross national happiness. India, in many ways, does it because Indians by nature are frugal. And we look at issues from in terms of cost. How do we reduce? How do we improve our efficiencies at home? And therefore, there is a hook on which you can hang this entire issue of climate change and what you need to do. And I'd like to just tell you a little story about how I figured that out as well in my last job in a company called Tata Chemicals. We do a little work in biodiversity. And we decided as one of those, we took a project on the extinction of the whale shark. I don't know, many of you may know about the whale shark. Well, this was getting extinct, and they used to come to the shores near one of the factories of that company. And they were being killed by the fishermen. First for their oil and then for their meat. And when we got into a collaboration and started working with the government and with the Coast Guard and so on and the fishermen, we weren't making much progress. And then we realized that we needed a hook. And therefore we went, actually, quite by chance, to somebody who was a religious leader, and we asked him, would you be able to help us? And he said, sure, I will, when he heard about the entire issue. And he came back, and then he spoke to the fishermen, and the fishermen and their families and their wives. And he said, you know, all of us look forward to our daughters coming home to have their first baby. Well, this animal, or this fish, is actually coming home to have its babies. And what are you doing? You're killing that animal. Would you kill your daughters when they come to have babies? And almost overnight, the whole attitude changed. The fishermen and their wives signed in and said, we'll never kill this fish again. And believe me, in the last 5 years, not a single whale shark has been killed. Now, climate change needs something like this. It needs belief. It needs a hook, so that year after year, we will believe in this concept and actually do something about it and change the face of the earth. And I may be working for a power company which is right in the thick of it, spewing quite a lot of carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere. But we have resolved that over the next 10, 15 years, we will target a dramatic reduction in the amount of carbon dioxide we spew. And we're working towards it, and we are succeeding. So I really have great hope. I believe that it's not necessary to do this in a multilateral fashion. I believe countries themselves would realize what they need to do, that this is one of the biggest challenges facing humanity, and they will work towards it. And that's what India is doing, and that's what China is doing. And we will succeed. And I believe that this is something that in another 10 years, you will find huge change. But I would beseech all of you here in Australia and other Western countries, don't be left behind. Thank you.
The first question is from a fellow called Arthur Fish. He says, last night we heard from Tim Jackson that the current economic and cultural model is unsustainable. Might developing nations not offer a blanker slate from which the brave new world might spring? I think I'd like to target that question first off at John.
I don't know that I should answer that question. I think somebody who... The only analogy I can think about that was a discussion of the Asian Development Bank about East Timor in 1999, when they said, this is an opportunity for us to prove that our policies work. This is a greenfield site, and we can implement the development programs we think will work to provide growth in that country. And I can only say that was a fundamentally massive mistake. That those people in that country have their cultures and their institutions and their systems, and you have to work with those and grow with those rather than impose a new model on top of that, if that was the intention of the question.
Okay, thanks, John. Prasad, would you like to comment, given the conclusion to your presentation?
Yeah, well, I'd just like to say that the current developmental model is unsustainable. We cannot continue to use resources the way we've been doing, and at the same time, you can't turn around and say that the 1 billion people in India or the 1.4 billion people in China should not aspire to a better life. So how do you do it? It has to be through a different model.
Kartikeya, would you like to respond?
I think, as both the speakers have said, we are looking at a new model. The world is looking at a new model. The problem is that we do not give people the skills and the confidence to be able to select a model which they have not seen happen. Even though they see the one before them having failed, they feel more secure in putting a transport system which looks like New York or looks like somewhere else. Or, you know, the inertia of the model is so enormous. And I think what many of us need to do is really change our minds. The models are all over the place. You can see the solutions. But we don't have the confidence. And coming from an institute which looks at education, our effort has been, how do you empower people, whether they're rural people, urban people, or students or others, to be able to make a decision which has not necessarily been made before, but to be able to make a decision that this is right, let's try it. And I think that's the challenge.
Thanks. Ian, I suppose in reading the question I was reminded of what Tim said earlier this evening about poverty, wealth. We're rich, you're poor, you become rich, and therefore things will be better. Maybe a take in relation to the work that you're engaged with.
Yeah, I think the thing is connect to something immediate which those people and communities need. So the connection to energy is really related to food, and food is related to the way they cook. And so, you know, our work in Ethiopia on energy efficient stoves is trying to do that, and just take people who are taking the wood sources, which is a source of livelihood, and from there actually using it indoors and polluting themselves and creating health dynamics. So the key for us is really to take an immediate need of energy efficient stoves. How do we create a more distributed energy network and distribution network, bring maybe renewable energies, and over time you then extend into that decentralized energy network that, you know, Prasad talked about, that you know, countries like Asia have and India have. And through that, over time, you can develop the model, but you need to connect it to an immediate need, and that requires you to listen to what the people want, rather than imposing a new model on them.
Thanks, Ian. Again, I'd encourage people to come forward to the microphones. We have a looming articulate presence here. Somebody's already asked 2 questions at the Deakin Lecture Series, and I'm quite happy for him to ask a third. I don't have a problem with it, but just in the interests of fairness, if there are others who haven't and want to, please make your way to the microphones. The second question, though, from the break, is a lot is talked about developed nations moving first. And indeed, you could say that the whole, it's essentially the predication of the Kyoto Protocol and the way that's been structured. But a question from Marilyn Fike, if that's how you pronounce it, is, are there any developed nations that the panel has faith might provide leadership on this question? Ian.
I think that it depends on which context you look. I suppose, you know, a country like Korea, countries which are really taking holistic policies in terms of climate change and the way they look at it. And I was struck in a presentation by Korea that they're really taking that concept of sustainability to quite extraordinary lengths in terms of the whole way they look at planning for the future. And I think it's those examples that help some of the least developed countries to develop it. But frankly, for some of the least developed countries, they need to find their own approaches as well. And you know, some of the work we've done in Ethiopia shows that the link between climate change, food security, and energy is one that's particularly relevant to them.
Kartikeya.
I think if you take countries which have worked it all out, it's probably going to be difficult. I mean, you can look at some of the Scandinavian countries, which have certainly shown leadership more than others in terms of commitments to overseas development aid, in terms of what they've done inside the countries and things. So there are countries which are way ahead. But the wonderful thing about climate change, I've found, is that solutions come from each and every place. Yesterday, I picked up the electricity bill, which our office got in Sydney. And I saw what a great idea, because in that bill, they were telling you what you spent last year and what you spent this year. Now, that's an idea we don't have in India, and I'm carrying that piece back. And I was saying that if I can just get that implemented in Ahmedabad, this whole trip would be worth it even just for that. So the good ideas are not the monopoly of anyone. And they are in tradition, and they are in new things. And I think that's what's exciting, because it's a global challenge, and their ideas are coming out all over the place. It's just that, as I said earlier, we need that confidence. And we need the ability to be able to see a good idea and take it. That's what's lacking is in our vision rather than in what's out there. I mean, people know how to do things all over the place. I want to also just mention to see how Nick's concept of justice has moved from yesterday to today. And it's where he says that it's not only the question you asked today, but yesterday as well. And this is what the intergenerational issues in climate change have done. They started by looking at justice only in one generation, and then they moved to intergenerational ones. So you've done from one debate to saying, for the whole series, have you done it? And I said, that's the type of transition we're all going through.
Well, Kartikeya, careful, because you're going to be up on this stage again tomorrow on an ethics session where you're going to be making a 20-minute speech on these matters. So don't shoot off too early. Now, Prasad, a comment from you. I mean, I think from what you were saying, well, you know, do we really need to worry about what developed economies are already doing? We're doing this in our own way, at our own pace, focusing on the need to create development whilst keeping a mind to emissions reduction. But your response?
Yeah, let me split it into two. Which is the country that I would want to take the lead? I think it has to be the United States, because I think that's the only country which has the clout, whether it's economic or technological clout, or indeed the entrepreneurial and the innovative clout that can actually do it. So I would want them to, and I'm disappointed that they haven't yet done it. But if I look at an example, I would actually choose China. And I'm going to say something here which is probably not politically right, but the Chinese Communist Party, I personally do not think cares a damn about climate change as an issue. But they do care a lot about the Chinese Communist Party. And they see climate change as being a huge threat to them, because it could destabilize everything that they're doing now. And what have they done? They have converted this entire issue into something which is commercial. So they have determined that in 10 years' time, the electric car market in the world is going to be dominated by China. Nobody else will be there. And similarly, they've done it with public transport and power, etc. So they have taken this entire climate change issue into one of commerce. And I think there is a lesson there for many countries. That's a great hook to put climate change on.
That whole Chinese notion of the harmonious society, you know, how can you have the harmonious society if you have the threats of business as usual under climate change? Yeah. John?
Thanks, Nick. Can I just say, do I need this thing? It occurs to me that Prasad just told us a story about saving a whale with a hook. Save a seal with a baseball bat tomorrow. Sorry. Let me say, I think actually there's plenty of analysis that tries to look at the costs to countries as measured, for example, in reductions in GDP growth or other measures of cost that show actually many developing countries are leading in emissions reductions ahead of most developed countries anyway. Brazil is one, Indonesia's another, and depending on how you count it, China may actually be incurring a greater cost to meet its targets than most OECD countries. So in fact, you know, developing countries probably are leading. And the other thing to say about that, I guess, is that, and I think Prasad's mentioning of Bhutan is very thought-provoking, in that there are countries, and certainly I'm thinking of very many villages in the Pacific I've visited, who have pursued a model of a good life and relatively probably appreciate the fact that they have something like a good life that is a very low carbon intensity lifestyle. So in fact, it's not just they're leading on decarbonising development, they're leading by demonstrating alternative modes of what the good life is and not pursuing the standard modern progress in the first place. So it's leadership by example of different ways of living that are low in carbon.
Do you see that as, in terms of what you've just said about developing countries actually stepping up, irrespective of what developed countries are doing, as a sort of source of positivity and optimism coming out of Copenhagen and the Copenhagen Accord, when one's actually broken down that division within Annex 1 and Annex 2 countries and developed versus developing economies, where you have a whole tranche of countries that are actually stepping up and saying, well, this is what we're pledging to do, or not?
I think there's a couple of geopolitical issues there. One, I think the thing that I really enjoyed about Copenhagen was the breaking up of the G77 bloc, which I think was a very monolithic and lethargic political grouping in the UNFCCC. And so, you know, the breaking out of the BRIC countries I think is actually very positive in the longer term. Secondly, I think there is some analysis out there that it's reasonably clear now that world leadership on climate change is world leadership, you know, in other spheres as well. And certainly there's some analysis that shows that, you know, when the US didn't ratify Kyoto, the European Union saw this as an opportunity to demonstrate to the world that it is a genuine world leader in all spheres. And I believe that this may be also something we see from China and India. We are you know, being a carbon superpower makes you a superpower, and being a responsible one makes you a world leader in various dimensions of affairs, and that plays across into your influence in world affairs in other fields like trade, human rights, and so on.
It's a very interesting insight. I was working in London just in late 2004 when you didn't yet have an active global climate treaty, and the main reason why the Russians actually ratified the Kyoto Protocol was because they believed themselves to be perceived. One of the reasons, there were more than one, but one of them was they were perceived as being a pariah state because of what happened at Beslan, and they needed a very clear symbol to say, actually, we're part of the global community, so we'll ratify the treaty. I mean, there are other reasons, but that was certainly a powerful one. We have a question, I think, from the microphone at the back, which is a new face, a woman in orange. Could you say your name, please?
Hi, my name's Lee Chung. I've just got a question to the panel in general. Just wondering if anyone had an opinion on mechanisms like the Clean Development Mechanism that are supposed to be helping developed countries. The examples that you've given are probably more local-based solutions, and I'm not sure whether those people are able to take advantage of those of the CDM. If anyone's got an opinion or personal experience.
Ian?
Yes, in World Vision we've actually looked to register a project, a reforestation project in Ethiopia using the Clean Development Mechanism. And it's fair to say that there are some fundamental issues associated with it. I think the first thing, just from an integrity perspective, is the need to really have a global carbon budget. So when we start talking about carbon offsets and emissions, and you have different baselines on different years, you really don't know what you're measuring anymore. And so that's a problem with the whole carbon offsets market that we've had to deal with. On a more practical and operational perspective, World Vision invested a fair bit in that project with the community in association with World Bank and with some support from the Ethiopian government. But over time, if we really want to bring some of the least developed countries into these kind of markets, we need to develop significant capacity to understand these technical rules. We need to simplify some of those rules and create some levels of assumptions. I think they're very important. And also to really create some national baseline measurements so that you don't do it at a project by project, but it becomes more of a program perspective and you can scale it up. So it's, those are pretty key issues. And I think another key issue for the community is who owns these carbon rights? How are they being transferred? And in the end, particularly when they relate to land use, how are communities, and that being an asset for the community, how is that being shared equitably and transparently?
Does anybody else want to comment? I don't necessarily need to go to every single head.
I'd just like to say one thing, Nick, that there are lots of smaller projects that get these CDM benefits, but whether it's through carbon offsets or through other mechanisms, I think one issue must be recognized, and that is without a fairly massive transfer of resources from the developed world to the developing world, we are not going to resolve this problem. And as long as the developed world believes that they're not going to part with those resources, we have an issue, whatever the mechanism is.
Thanks, and I'm reminded of the comment from Tim Costello in relation to the funds that were announced at Copenhagen and the way in which those funds, are they new funds or are they funds which are also part of existing funds that are going towards human development, but we can sort of call that climate adaptation or climate investment. So I think that the point you make is a very good one. Now, it's 20 minutes past 7, as I've said. We're going to be finishing this session at exactly 7:30. We have another question from the front here, and I think the gentleman with the grey hair who stood up first.
Could I ask, as an Australian...
Can we have your name?
Morris Alexander.
Yep.
As an Australian, can I ask the Australians in the panel, and perhaps with to comment on my feeling listening both to Tim Costello and presumably by definition the representative from World Vision on the panel, and the Indians, that I felt really concerned that here in Australia we really haven't progressed much beyond the old attitudes of 50 years ago when we were representative of the British colonial system, and our attitude towards Asia was a bit like, was a product of that. And it seems to me that the question is whether the well-meaning statements made by people like Tim Costello are not really understanding that we in Australia are very much not the West, we are part of Asia, and we should be learning from China and India, not pretending that we know better than them and we've got better solutions than them in the old colonial style.
Thanks, Morris. I won't ask Kartikeya or Prasad to comment on that question, but I will go to Ian first.
Yeah, I think that the point Tim was really making is that this is a global issue, and we need global solutions. And when you really start looking at the analysis of emission reductions and who are making serious commitments, the point John made earlier of developing countries are actually making some of those significant commitments, and that's where some of that leadership's being shown. And that when you look at developed countries, and with Australia having one of the highest emission per capita, and also being an exporter of those emissions, we have some fundamental issues to address in the way we look at it. And there's absolutely, we need to learn from many other places, but we also need to understand where we stand in terms of that slice of cake.
John.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting comment. My research for nearly 10 years has been looking at sort of social vulnerability and adaptation to climate change, mostly in the Pacific, but a little bit in China and East Timor. And in I guess the last 3 years I've become involved in research and policy on this issue in Australia. And it's quite clear, I would have thought, that Australia could learn an awful lot from Fiji about how to deal with social vulnerability to climate change. We could learn an awful lot from China about how to deal with all sorts of river management problems. We haven't done this, but other countries in the world have been learning and responding to adaptation to climate change now for 5 or 6 years, and we're just late to the party. And an awful lot of what I do is relay stories about what's happening in country X, Y, or Z, and what that means for us in Australia to help our communities adapt to climate change.
Thanks, John. It's just nearly 25 minutes past, and I do need to hand over to Tim Flannery. So I think I'd like to take 2 more questions from the floor. So I'd ask the questioner at the front to be as concise as he can be. It's a question, it's not a statement, and it's pertinent to what we've just heard.
If we can interpret...
your name, sorry.
Peter Cuffey. If we can interpret Prasad's critique as an implicit distanciation of China and India and other developing countries as well from the kind of Euro-Americo-centric multilateralism of the bygone era, to what extent can a country like Australia support India and other developing countries through NGO work in permaculture, for example?
That might be a question for Kartikeya.
I think the answer is yes.
Then again, it might not be. It might be a question.
I would think that it's difficult to just say Australia has this view. In Australia, you have several views. And depending on who you hear, you have to read the morning paper to know how many views there are. I think there are people like Tim, who spoke this morning, earlier today, who understand these issues and who understand the developing world, perhaps sometimes even better than some people who might live in Indian cities and who are really not connected to Indian villages. So I would think of it as a little more personal than to try and block things as countries. But when you do talk about countries, and if you talk about them in terms of the way they negotiate in climate change negotiations, there it is very clear where countries vote and what they do. And these are in these blocks, one likes it or not. John did mention how those blocks change, because small island states think differently from the big countries which we call BRIC today, the Brazil, India, China, Russia. So these countries do think differently. But when it comes down to it, it becomes very much a political alignment. Now, the problem is that you have this discussion happening at a bureaucratic, economic type of level, while the problem really does need to be dealt with by the heart as well, which is missing in some of these discussions, because you have very hard-nosed people who are looking at gains and other things, and you're surprised how they talk. And the big question, therefore, is like when Tim ended, and he spoke about that singer, the person who sang, and how he brought it. He did mention how that needs to come into this discussion. Now, that is not at Copenhagen, and it's not going to be in Bonn just now, and it's not going to be in Mexico. And that's the problem. So this is truly a global problem. It's not a government problem. And we are looking at governments solving it alone. I don't think they will be able to do it. It will ultimately happen because people want to solve it. And they bring pressure on their governments, but not the other way around. So I think we need to bring, it will be solved by people understanding what climate change issues are and being articulate enough and impacting the way politicians think and do it. And I don't think we need to look at leadership elsewhere as much as we need to look at it in ourselves.
Thanks, Kartikeya. It's 28 minutes past 7. Tim is going to be closing proceedings. I know Ian wants to respond, and then I might just go to a final comments, if there are any, from Prasad and John, and then Tim will take the stage. Ian.
Yeah, just with the answers in terms of transfer of technologies, it's also when you look at community importance to really understand some of the solutions can be very simple and largely related to behavioural change. So, for example, not quite related to permaculture, but there's regeneration, and a colleague of mine in World Vision, Tony Renato, came up and in his work in Niger with a concept called natural regeneration for farmers in small communities. And as a result of that, over 20 years, it's the only country in Africa that has actually reversed the trend in terms of reforestation. And it really came from using the roots, really creating community education and protecting that and growing it, that it has occurred. So we do not, shouldn't always assume they're really complex and technical.
Thanks, Ian. John, a final word?
No.
No? Good. There was a word. It was no. Prasad.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I've always been surprised that there hasn't been greater interchange between Australia and India, for instance. And I think Australia, I think it's happening, but I think Australia needs to realize that it's part of Asia. And when that happens, there will be change.
Thank you.
Well, what a wonderful and instructive session this has been. We've had some fantastic quotes from my great hero, Gandhi. But this evening's session has brought to my mind yet another Gandhi quote. When he visited Great Britain in the early 20th century in his loincloth and was interviewed by a journalist, the journalist said something like, "So what do you make of British civilization?" And he said, "I think it'd be a wonderful idea." And we need some humility. We need to realise we will learn from what we're hearing here. I am sick of hearing in Australia, why should Australia go first in this climate-ish debate? And I just want to share a couple of the things our Indian colleagues have shared with me through the evening. Prasad Menon has pointed out that India has recently instituted a tax on coal that's burned, a carbon tax in India. It's only small, it's only at $1 a tonne, but if India can do that, then surely Australia can do the same thing. I've heard from Kartikeya about the most extraordinary consultations that go on around environmental legislation in India, where the Centre for Environmental Education goes into regional India with booklets that explain the legislation very simply, and there's a blank column opposite each of the points in the legislation, and they ask people, fishermen, farmers, everyone, scientists, teachers, to make comments on the side. And all of that is brought back and synthesised and given back to the government, and it becomes a very powerful tool because then it is very explicit why certain legislative steps are being taken, because the public support them. Industry respects that, the government is strengthened, the democracy is strengthened, and things can go forward in a much more effective manner. If we can't learn from examples like that from India, I don't know that there is any hope for this country to change. But could I just thank you all for being here, ask you to thank and congratulate our fantastic panel and take the learnings from this evening home with you.